Good afternoon, class. We will be continuing with the last portion of our lecture for the law on obligations. We will still talk about chapter 4, the modes of extinguishment of obligations. So the last topic is section 6, novations. Novation is defined as the total or partial extinction of an obligation through the creation of a new obligation which will substitute the original obligation. Now here, the original obligation is extinguished or modified by changing yung palitan yung object or principal condition, palitan yung debtor by substitution, or palitan yung creditor by subrogation. So remember class, palitan ang object or principal conditions, debtor or creditor, there is novation. Now also remember, technically, novation is not a mode of extinguishment of obligation because an obligation will remain. So, kung i-modify mo siya, nandiyan pa rin yung original obligation subject to the modifications. Now, if in-extinguish mo yung original, a new one will be substituted in its place. So, technically, hindi talaga nagkakaroon ng extinguishment, but nagkakaroon lang ng change doon sa form ng obligation. Now, kinds of novation may be total. According to Constitution, may be total, may be express or implied. So express is it is declared in unequivocal terms, malinaw. Implied is old obligation and new obligation are essentially incompatible with one another, na hindi sila mapapagsama. According to how implied novation is done pala, you can make substantial changes in the object or subject matter of the contract, meaning from a cell phone, papalitan mo yung object to a ring or a bracelet, etc., etc. Now, what else? You can also make substantial changes in the cost or consideration of the contract. So, substantial changes in the cost, meaning the price, yan, especially in a contract of sale. Now, if yung purchase price is 500, tinaasan mo to 1,000 pesos, that is novation. Now, if yung price is ni-reduce mo naman to from 500 to 300 pesos, remember, this is not novation, but actually implied remission. So, yun ang tandaan natin. Upward change in price, novation. Reduction in price is remission. What else? You can also make substantial changes in the principal terms or conditions of the contract. So, principal terms, siguro, payable in 6 months, gagawin mong 1 year. Or conditions naman, an obligation, conditional obligation, tapos gagawin mo siyang pure obligation. So, that is a substantial change in the principal conditions of the contract. Now, according to extent or effect, it may be total extinctive. Old obligation is completely extinguished, or it may be partial, modificatory, or imperfect or improper. They are the same animals, remember. Old obligation is merely modified, so change is merely incidental to the main obligation. Original is still in force except insofar as the modifications are concerned. So what else? According to subject, object, or purpose. So it may be real, it may be personal, and also it may be mixed. So real novation, object or cost, principal conditions are changed. Personal naman, persons are changed, either the debtor or the creditor. So remember, if you change the debtor, it is called passive novation. So there are two kinds of passive novation: expromission, initiative to change the debtor or to substitute the debtor comes from the third person himself. So usually without knowledge or against the will of the original debtor, but always with the consent of the creditor. Now, in delegation, remember, creditor accepts a third person to take the place of the debtor at the instance of the original debtor. So, the initiative to change the debtor here came from the original debtor himself. Tapos, yung third person, yun na yung papalit sa kanya. Yung third person, original debtor and creditor should consent to delegation. Now, you can also change the creditor in case it is called an active novation. So, kinds of active novation: legal, it is by operation of law; conventional, it takes place by agreement of the parties; and also in mixed, remember, it is a combination of real and personal novations. So, the requisites of novation are: number 1, there is a valid previous valid obligation. So, kailangan valid yung original obligation. If the original obligation is not valid, there is nothing to novate. So, if the old obligation is void or non-existent, technically, there is nothing to novate. Kasi nga yung mga void obligation, technically, wala talaga sila, hindi sila nag-exist because they are void. Wala tayong innovate, wala tayong papalitan. Now, if the old obligation is voidable, novation is possible provided that it has not been annulled, because voidable obligations are valid obligations until they are annulled. Obviously, if they are annulled, edi babalik tayo sa original rule. If the obligation is annulled, syempre, na-nullify na yan, naging non-existent na rin yan. So, there is nothing to novate. Now, however, kung kabaliktaran naman, original obligation is ratified, it can be novated. Pagka na-ratify ang obligation, it is cleansed of its defects from the beginning as if wala siyang defect. So, as if hindi siya voidable. So, it can be novated, obviously. Number 2, there is capacity and intention of the parties to modify or extinguish the obligation. Remember, class, that novation is not presumed. In 1292, it must be established by clear and unmistakable facts, and there is express agreement of the parties. Remember, kung wala namang express, wala kayong narinig na express agreement, there are acts which signify that the two obligations are incompatible with one another in every material respect. Take note also of the third requisite, modification or extinguishment of the obligation, which is a result of the novation. And number 4, creation of a valid new obligation. Original obligation must be valid, new obligation must also be valid. Now, if the new obligation is void, 1297 will apply, original ones shall subsist. Now, the exception is that if the parties intended that the former original obligation should be extinguished in any event. So, based on a stipulation ito, na even if the new one is void obligation, yung original will no longer subsist. What if the new obligation is voidable? Remember, novation can take place. Voidable obligation is valid until it is annulled. Now, if the valid obligation has been annulled, we will revert to the general rule. The old obligation will subsist. Yan. So, yun ang tandaan natin sa voidable contract. Unless again, the parties intended that the former relation should be extinguished in any event. Now, kinds of passive novation or substitution, we have already discussed a while ago in passing. Expropriation initiative comes from a third person. It will require, obviously, the consent of the third person and the creditor. So here, there's a third person who volunteers to pay for the debt of the debtor. So ito, nagmagaling ito. Wala siyang utang, gusto niya magkautang. So yun ang third person na ito sa expropriation. So obviously, the third person must consent to the expropriation and the creditor must consent. Because remember, payment from a third person may be refused by the creditor, may be accepted, may be refused by the creditor. That is the general rule in payment, which I have already discussed. Now, it is essential, class, in expropriation that the old debtor be released from the obligation. Otherwise, there is no expropriation. So remember, in expropriation, third person, lalapitan niya yung creditor. O pre, ako na lang magbabayad ng utang ni debtor. Kung ganun lang, remember, there is no clear expropriation. Now, if sinabi ni third person kay debtor, oy, creditor, ay kay creditor pala, sinabi ni third person kay creditor, oy, creditor, ako na lang magbabayad ng utang ni debtor, wag mo nang singilin si debtor, debtor is released from the obligation. Remember, valid expropriation. In delegation, remember, initiative comes from the old debtor himself. In delegation, all the parties must consent. So remember, new debtor, old debtor, and the creditor must consent in delegation. Here, the initiative comes from the old debtor himself. So, yung old debtor ang nakaisip na i-substitute siya with the new debtor. So remember, para malaman ninyo kung expropriation ba yan or delegation, ito ang tanong. Kanino nanggaling yung idea? Kung ang idea ay nanggaling kay third person, remember, class, that this is expropriation. Now, if the idea came from the old debtor himself, this is a delegation. In delegation as well, the debtor must be released from the obligation. Otherwise, there is no valid delegation. Tingnan nyo lang, saan ba nanggaling yung idea na palitan yung debtor? So what else? So remember also the right of the new debtor who pays. In expropriation, payment by the new debtor will give him the right to beneficial reimbursement. Remember, sa expropriation, ang initiative ng payment ng new debtor came from the new debtor himself. So siya yung nagpresenta na siya ang magbabayad. So dahil siya ang nagpresenta, it does not require the consent of the old debtor. So probably, baka nga hindi pa niya alam. yung novation. So remember, itong new debtor will not have, as against the old debtor, the new debtor as against the old debtor will not have the rights of a creditor. So hindi magiging yung new debtor hindi magiging creditor ng old debtor kasi nga walang consent na required sa expromission. So remember, dahil nga walang consent, ang binibigay lang na right sa new debtor is beneficial reimbursement. Hindi siya magiging creditor ng old debtor. So that is what you have to remember. The rules on beneficial reimbursement under 1236 will apply. What else? If the payment was made with the consent of the original debtor and on his own initiative. So remember, on the initiative of the original debtor. And obviously, kung ang original debtor ang nag-initiate, may consent ang original debtor. So, original debtor consents, tapos yung third person will consent. Siyempre, hindi mo naman siya pwedeng gawing liable kung hindi siya nagko-consent. And obviously, the creditor must consent to the novation here. So, anyway, if in case of delegation, dahil may consent ang original or old debtor, yung new debtor will become a creditor or will step into the shoes of the creditor. So, yung new debtor who is substituted to the place of the old debtor with respect to the creditor, merong substitution. Pero remember also that with respect to the old debtor, dahil napalitan ang kanyang creditor, yung old creditor, napalitan ng new debtor slash new creditor slash third person, merong subrogation insofar as the old debtor is concerned. So anyway, in short, the new debtor steps into the shoes of the old of the creditor. And remember, new debtor is entitled to legal subrogation, which obviously will include reimbursement of whatever yung whatever amount that the third person or new debtor or now new creditor will pay. So, ulitin ko, in beneficial reimbursement, ang ire-reimburse lamang is kung ano yung pakinabang ng debtor. In legal subrogation, whatever the third person pays will have to be reimbursed by the original debtor. So, yun ang tandaan natin. In delegation, 1237 will apply. What else? What if the new debtor is insolvent or there is a non-fulfillment of the obligation? In short, new debtor does not pay. Anong mangyayari? In expromission, imagine mo sa expromission, siya na nga yung nag-volunteer, siya na nga yung nagpalapad ng papel at nagpasikat na siya ang magbabayad ng utang. Then, hindi siya makabayad. Remember, class, here, new debtor's insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation will not revive the action against the old debtor whose obligation is already extinguished. So, kahit naman, kaya kayong mga creditor, mag-ingat kayo sa expromission because mag-ingat kayo actually sa lahat ng changes ng debtor kasi baka mamaya yung papalit, wala ring pera. Mas may pag-asa pa kayo dun sa original debtor. So anyway, here, the action against the original debtor will not be revived in case hindi nakabayad yung bagong debtor. Bakit ganon, ma'am/sir? Kasi remember, creditor can refuse to accept. Ngayon kung refuse to accept payment from a third person, ngayon kung tatanggapin niya yung third person, at least dapat siya na yung mag-check or mag-background check kung kaya naman siyang bayaran ng bagong debtor. So, yun ang tandaan ninyo. Look out pa rin ng creditor yan. What else? In case naman of delegation, 1295, there are actually two rules technically. So, in case of a non-fulfillment of the obligation due to causes other than insolvency, so debtor is not liable. So, if the new debtor cannot pay because of other reasons, basta hindi insolvency, old debtor is not liable. Now, in case of insolvency, these are the rules. The general rule is that the old debtor is not liable if the insolvency of the new debtor occurred only after delegation. So, nagkaroon ng delegation, Remember, consent creditor, consent old debtor, consent new debtor. Tapos bigla naging insolvent yung new debtor. So remember, old debtor will not be liable. What else? Exceptions to the general rule. So remember, pagka sinabi kong exceptions, old debtor will be liable. In case of number 1, insolvency is already existing, was already existing and of public knowledge, although it may be unknown to the old debtor at the time of delegation. So, insolvent na pala at the time of delegation yung new debtor. Even if the old debtor is not aware, mare-revive na yung action. Kasi ito ay public knowledge na. So, kung public knowledge na to, malamang-lamang alam talaga ng debtor, even if honestly, ng old debtor, even if honestly, hindi talaga niya alam. So, dahil everybody knows, except for the old debtor, remember class, the action against the old debtor will be revived. So, pwedeng mag-proceed against the old debtor. What else? Number 2, the insolvency was already existing and known to the debtor. So, this connotes bad faith class. Alam naman pala ng old debtor that yung taong pinopropose niya na palitan siya, na i-substitute siya, is already insolvent, even if it is not publicly known. Remember, at the time of delegation, yung obligation will revert to the original or old debtor in case of failure of the new debtor to pay. So anyway, those are the rules for passive novation. Take note, class, also of the kinds of active novation or subrogation, legal subrogation, which takes place by operation of law. This is not presumed except in cases clearly provided by law. And number 2, conventional or voluntary subrogation. So remember, this is based on agreement of the parties. So this must be clearly established in order that it may take place. And because it is from agreement, all of the parties must consent. So remember, new creditor, old creditor, and also the debtor must consent to the subrogation. Now, also take note of the cases of legal subrogation. So, legal subrogation ito mga to because they are expressly provided by law. Number 1, creditor pays another creditor who is preferred. So, a regular or ordinary creditor will pay a preferred creditor even without the knowledge of the debtor. So, debtor is indebted to creditor 1 and creditor 2. This is the example in your book. It is on point. So anyway, creditor 1 is a preferred creditor. Let us say 100,000 ang utang ni debtor sa kanya, secured by a mortgage. Meron siyang preference over the mortgage, kaya siya ay preferred creditor. Siya ang unang pwedeng mag-foreclose ng mortgage in case debtor does not pay. Now, creditor 2 is an ordinary creditor. Let us say for 80,000 pesos. Wala siyang preference, ni wala nga security yung kanyang debt. Now, if creditor 2 pays the obligation of debtor to creditor 1. In short, itong si creditor 2, inabonohan niya yung utang ni debtor kay creditor 1. So, binayaran niya yung 100,000. Remember, creditor 2 will be legally subrogated into the rights of creditor 1. So, as to the 100,000 secured by a mortgage, he will be a preferred creditor. As to yung 80,000 na utang sa kanya talaga ni debtor, he is an ordinary creditor. So, yun ang tandaan nyo. This will happen by operation of law. What else? Number 2, third person who has no interest in the obligation pays with the express or tacit approval of the debtor. So, this is 1237, case of legal subrogation, which we have already studied. Now, debtor owes creditor, third person pays creditor with the consent of the debtor. Remember, because the debtor consents, itong third person will be subrogated into the rights of the original creditor. And as to the debtor, he will become the new creditor. He will have the right of reimbursement plus a legal subrogation. Reimbursement to any amount that is paid by the new creditor. So, what else? Pinag-aralan natin yan. Third person with interest in the obligation pays even without the knowledge of the debtor. So, a guarantor is a person with interest in the obligation. Debtor is indebted to creditor and the debt is secured by a guarantor. Guarantor pays the creditor. So, remember, your guarantor will become the new creditor by operation of law. Merong legal subrogation. So, effect of legal subrogation, 1303, transfer to the new creditor the credit and all rights and actions that could have been exercised by the former creditor. So the rights for penalties, mortgages, etc., rights against guarantor, maipapasa doon sa new creditor. What else? Partial subrogation. What is the effect? The creditor to whom partial payment has been made by the new creditor remains a creditor to the extent of the balance of the debt. And in case of insolvency of the debtor, he is given a preferential right under this article to recover the remainder as against the new creditor. So the example in your book is again on point. Debtor is indebted to creditor 500,000. So with the consent of the debtor and creditor, a third person pays part of the obligation. So let us say third person T pays 200,000 pesos out of the 500 na utang ni debtor. So remember, there is here partial subrogation. So dalawa na ngayon ang creditor ni debtor. Yung creditor ni D debtor is C and also si T who partially paid yung utang. Now, remember, if kulang yung pera ni debtor, let us say, hindi niya mabayaran yung dalawang creditors niya, preferred yung original creditor who is C. So, siya ang unang mababayaran ahead of the creditor who paid partially and is subrogated later on with the consent of original debtor and creditor. What else? Other rules in novation. Effect of novation in accessory obligations. So remember, extinguishment of the principal obligation will extinguish also the accessory obligations such as pledges, mortgages, and guarantees. So if the principal obligation is extinguished as a general rule, mawawala na rin yung mga accessory obligations. Now, the exception is that the parties agree that despite the extinguishment of the old obligation, the accessory obligation will carry over to the new obligation. And remember, provided that the debtors of the said accessory obligations give their consent. Also, in case the accessory obligation is created in favor of a third person, unless the third person gives his consent to the novation, the principal, the accessory obligation will remain hanggat walang consent yung third person to the novation. So, pagka na-consent yung third person to the novation, it will be extinguished yung accessory in favor of a third person. What else? Presumption where original obligation is subject to a condition. Conditions attached to old obligation will also follow yung new obligation, except if there is a contrary stipulation. So anyway, that's it for novation and the law on obligations. Class, please stand by for contracts. Thank you and good afternoon.